Good morning. Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church Public Affairs Forum. The forum is free and open to the public almost every Sunday at 11:30 a.m. Everyone is welcome. And this is part of the social justice ministry of our church. For more information, you can go to the web at austinuu.org and find out about future forums. Again, everyone is welcome. He holds the Audrey and Bernard Rappaport Centennial Chair in Economics and Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He co-chairs the National Center on Education and the Economy and is a trustee and founder of the Economic Policy Institute and a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Ray Marshall.
You want me to go up here? Well, thank you very much. I was trying to recall how many times I had spoken to this group, and I think this is the fourth time, and each time it's been a different subject, so you all probably figure that I'm having trouble making up my mind about what I want to do. I think I spoke with you about economic policy, labor relations, school reform, and now immigration. But each of these, I think, are very, very important subjects, and subjects that cry out for public attention and, I think, public solution. Let me say just a bit about how I got involved in this and what I'm doing now, what I'm trying to do. As a labor economist, I have always had a strong interest in immigration because we are a country of immigrants. Immigrants have formed most of the growth of our workforce for the last 20 years and will be most of the growth of our workforce for the next 20. And that's primarily because of demographics. There will be no net increase in prime working age natives for the next 20 years, which means, therefore, that if we grow, it will be because we take in immigrants. But as a labor economist, I was more concerned about the quality of the immigration experience as well as the quantity. The quality is extremely important, and especially now. The future, economically, belongs to the creative, to the innovators, people who just make routine goods and services that anybody can make will have a hard time making the kind of living that Americans have been accustomed to. It is pretty well demonstrated that diverse societies are much more creative and innovative than homogeneous societies. And we could spend a long time talking about why that's true, but it is. So not only will we rely on immigrants for the growth of our workforce, but also for the quality. But I hasten to say that how well we receive the benefits of immigration will depend on how we handle the downside. The downside is that we could have serious social, political conflict if we don't do it right. If we don't bring in people and give them opportunity to move up, they will be alienated from our society and therefore generate the kind of turmoil that you now see and protest that you see in many other countries, especially European countries that have not prepared very well for the assimilation of immigrants into their systems. The main reason for that is that many people always consider immigration to be temporary, especially if you're talking about foreign workers, and it never is. As one Swiss demographer said, we asked for labor and we got people. And I said, and you were surprised. And to think that people were like commodities, that you could turn them on and off and ship them back to Turkey or wherever you imported them from. You can't do that. It's always a permanent process, and therefore you need to prepare for that. And I just finished a book on employment-based immigration in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. I think the Canadians are about the only country that I've studied so far that have developed a good policy and therefore minimized their conflict and maximized the advantages of immigration. I'm not sure that the Canadians were that much smarter than other people, though they have paid attention to policy. But the fact that they had conflict with Quebec and the Quebecois, the secessionists, and understood that if they were going to hold Canada together in the 1950s, they'd have to do it on the basis of equality and incorporating the French-speaking people into Canada. So as a consequence of that, they developed a policy. And by the time they started getting a very diverse immigrant population, they had a policy to deal with it. And it's very simple, that there's a fundamental set of principles, democratic, equalitarian principles, that if you want to be a Canadian, you have to subscribe to. And diversity is one of those, so long as you accept those fundamental democratic principles, the equality of opportunity, the equality of men and women, a democratic process. And if people subscribe to those, they can become Canadians. If they do not, they discourage you from becoming a Canadian. Australians do the same thing, though they have not done it quite as well, because they didn't have the Quebecois to make them get the lesson early. All those countries, and including the United States, up until the 1960s, had a whites-only policy of immigration. And that was abandoned by most of the former members of the British Commonwealth during the 1960s, because it became very clear that it was a dumb policy and that they were going to have great trouble attracting well-educated, highly qualified people unless they abandoned that policy. And we all did, United States, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And all did it about the same time. Now, so immigration, if you're concerned about the future of the country and broadly shared prosperity, as I am, I believe that ought to be the guiding policy of our country. Then you have to be concerned about how you deal with immigration. Now, personally, I got involved in the Carter administration, and it's in some sense emblematic of the problem. When we put the president's agenda together after the election and before the inauguration, we were going over the agenda, and the president said, "Does anybody see anything that we've left out?" And I looked at the list and raised my hand and said, "Yes, you've left out immigration." And then we had a little debate about that. The immigrants in the administration didn't think we had an immigration problem. Like Mike Blumenthal, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, but a Chinese immigrant to the United States. And I pointed out that all the things I've already said is that our problem is that we don't have a coherent policy. We don't do things with a plan in advance, and therefore we get an increasingly large number of unauthorized immigrants in the United States, and that will cause us trouble in the long run if we don't deal with it. It's not good for any democratic system to have a permanent underclass. And that was what we were in danger of. Yeah, so after the debate, the president says, all right, Ray, you're in charge of immigration. So, and I had already learned from the Navy not to do that, not to, never to volunteer. But I had co-responsibility with Griffin Bell, the Attorney General. And we set about trying to have a decent immigration policy. We had great trouble with it because it's one of the most controversial and difficult political issues that I have ever dealt with, much more difficult than the civil rights movement, which took a very long time and all kinds of problems before we finally got it done. Faced many of the same hazards that we face with immigration. And partly it's because there are no clear political lines on immigration. Unfortunately, from my perspective, they are forming now. But if you just go back to the Bush administration, those lines were not as clear as they are now. And that meant it was hard to organize your friends and disperse your enemies, which is what you try to do if you're trying to get something done politically. But we did create a good analytical and factual basis. We created a select commission on immigration and refugee policy, which was the background to the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. We started this 10 years earlier, 8 or 9 years earlier, but didn't get it done until 1980. And we passed a very bad law in 1986, partly because of the political difficulty. We passed a law that did not meet the standards of a good law. It was not fair. It was not transparent. It was not enforceable. And it was not sensible. Those are the standards for a good law. It was unenforceable because the heart of the control mechanism was an employer authorization system, employment authorization system, which required that you have an identifier so that you could tell if people were in the country legally, and we didn't. We had 22 different identifiers, which means we had none, because you could get all those counterfeited. But worse than that, we put the employer in charge of enforcing the law. Well, the employer had neither the means nor the will to do that. Here you're putting people who really want to hire the unauthorized workers for their own profit-maximizing reasons, and you tell them to determine which of these 22 documents that somebody brings to you is legal. You can always say, well, it looked legal to me, and did. And we didn't even try to enforce that law very much up until 1996, which compounded the problem of enforcement. So then I got involved with trying to reform that law by also invitation. Senators Kennedy and Obama, during the time that we were trying to pass the 2006, 7, 8 immigration reform law. And I was fairly optimistic about that. It seemed to have bipartisan support, but we're unable to get it done. And for the same reason, that is, the people who benefit from the present system are going to make it very difficult to change the system. And unfortunately, in our system, it's very easy to prevent people from developing a sensible system, because all you really need to have under present arrangements to cause that to happen is 40 members of the Senate in order to sustain a filibuster. And I've calculated that those 40 members can be from states that represent about 10% of the U.S. population. So you have a situation in our country which is unique, and that is people who represent about 10% of the population can prevent things from happening, supported by 90%, by people who represent 90% of the population, and that's the tragedy of the filibuster. I ran into that trying to modernize our labor laws. We passed a bill through the House of Representatives with about a 100-vote majority. As I recall, it was 97 or 8. We had 58 solid votes for passage in the Senate, and I finally got 59 to get it passed. The group filibusterers filibustered for 5 weeks to prevent the passage of modernization of our labor laws. The consequence of that, and we never got it because there was so much behind it that we needed to get passed that finally the supporters gave up. Said, well, we've got to deal with the Panama Canal, the energy crisis, the budget, many other things, so we can't continue this fight, and we're not going to be able to get the 60th vote. And at that time, majority of the senators from the South were Democrats, but we only got one of those Democrats from the South to support modernizing our labor laws. So after that episode, I wrote an article, the title of which was "Getting Immigration Reform Right," to try to say what we need to do. And the consequence of that was I got invited again to see what you could do to get that passed by Senator Kennedy again, and this time by a group of labor and immigrant rights groups who said, well, in fact, Teddy Kennedy said, if you can get people organized around that framework and keep everybody together this time, because they weren't together last time. The unions were split among themselves. They were split. The civil rights and immigrant rights groups were split. So it was not easy for the opponents of the bill to split the proponents, and to keep it from happening. As Teddy Kennedy said to me, he said, "Don't try to make a deal with the Chamber of Commerce of the United States." That's the first advice I would give you. He said they kept digging it up and burying it and digging it up and burying it until they killed it. This time, come in with a unified position and deal with the business community, which we do. I can deal with the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce, and I can deal with, and I have, with the Governor's Council, Business Council, who are very sensible about this and not ideological and understand what we need to do. So for the last 2 years, I've been out trying to organize around the framework that I'll tell you about in a minute. Let me emphasize what I mean by sensible. And sensible, I mean that it's based on the facts. One of my rules is don't ever recommend anything until you agree on the facts. It's amazing how much you can reduce the differences between people if you'll do that. Second, no blame casting. Let's not figure out who got us into the situation we're in now, but talk about what got us into the situation we're in now. And the third rule is everything's not equally important. So let's establish some priorities about what we're going to do. And sensible also means that you consider the alternatives before you come down on the side of a particular position. And one thing the sensibility test requires you to do is to consider the alternatives and whether or not those make sense in the light of what you're talking about. The trouble that we've got with immigration is that there's so many people who are ideologues and who believe there's a simple solution to this complex problem, and therefore they want to stick with that simple solution. There are no simple solutions, and it has to be comprehensive or it won't work, because the parts of the system reinforce each other, and therefore you have to, I think, have a comprehensive approach to it. Now, let me emphasize what part of this immigration problem I want to focus on. I want to focus on what is actually, quantitatively, a relatively small part of it. Represents about 15% of all immigrants, and that is employment-based immigration. I think that's the heart of the problem, is people come here to work, but 64% of the from 2005 to 2009, 64% of all immigrants came for family-based reasons. We're unique with that. Among most other countries, the proportion is 60 to 65% employment-based, and family-based is a much smaller portion, 20% or less in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Part of the reason for that is that with the globalization of the labor market, which really happened with a vengeance in around 2000 and after 2000, when the East Europeans and former Soviet countries, China and India, all joined the global economy, we doubled the size of the global labor market, almost overnight. And since that's happened, countries have adopted a very different economic strategy than they had before. That economic strategy is a shared prosperity strategy, or a high value added strategy, which means that those industrialized countries realize that their future depends on the quality of their workforce, and that you have only two options for the future. You can either work harder or you can work smarter. And if you're going to work smarter, you've got to have well-educated, well-trained workforce. So they have therefore focused on that as the guiding principle for immigration. Now, to some degree, it's a false choice to say family-based versus employment-based. The reason it's a false choice is because family members are going to work. In fact, if you've got your family here, you can participate in the economy much better than if there's some other place. And therefore, the distinction is how you got here, not what you did after you got here. That is, family-based members will work, and people who come in under the employment-based system will bring their families, if it's going to work right. One thing we did wrong in 1986 was say, we will adjust your status, but we won't let you bring in your families. Well, what does that do? That guarantees that you will have more unauthorized immigration, because people are going to bring in their families. Sensible means understand how people are going to act. And you can prevent that maybe, but you're going to have to work real hard at it in order to prevent what they're inclined to do naturally. So now the other immigration, we have humanitarian, which is refugee and asylees, which is the least controllable part. It has been. It's become more controlled now. And we in the United States have a unique category called diversity. Diversity accounts for about 4%, about humanitarian 15%, which means refugees and asylees are about the same proportion of immigrants as employment-based. And about 4% are humanitarian, and about 4% diversity, 15% humanitarian, 4% diversity, and 2% other things. Now, it's also important to make the distinction between temporary and permanent immigrants. Actually, the term that most countries use for what we call immigrants, temporary immigrants, is migrants. And you're not an immigrant until you're settled. The Australians talk about settled immigrants. And we have a smaller proportion of permanent immigrants in the United States every year than most other countries, and a much larger proportion of temporary and unauthorized, though Canada and Australia are also having a much larger proportion of their employment-based immigration as temporary. But theirs is very different from ours in one sense, and that difference is that they take in temporary workers with the idea that they're going to become permanent. So they're kind of apprentice, or as the Canadians say, they're Canadians in learning. They're learning to be Canadians. And they found through research that those folks adjust to their societies much better than people who come directly in without knowing much about the country and all the rest. So they have an internship of a couple of years and then allow you to apply for permanent residency. Now, let me say a bit about the importance. I won't say much more than I've already said about that subject because I want to spend most of the rest of the time talking about the framework that seems to me to be useful to understand what we do about immigration. I've already mentioned the economic importance of immigration, and it'd be hard to overstate that. But it also is a very important political issue. The future of this country will depend on who gets the Latino vote, because it's the fastest growing. It's not only the fastest growing population in terms of numbers, especially, but it's also strategically located. It's located in those places where Democrats and Republicans are fairly balanced. And that means that how they go frequently will depend on how the state goes. A precursor to that, as with many other things, is California. Immigration turned California, among other things, but immigration was an important part of it, from a red state to a blue state in a relatively rapid time frame. And it was because of the strategic location and the size. So politically, it's very important. The Latino community is very diverse, and it is actually organized only by one issue so far that I've found anyway, and that's anti-immigration sentiment is the best way to organize that. And with the growth of the nativist and the anti-immigrant sentiment, you will unify the Latino community, and therefore they will rebel against that. It's not clear to me how it will ultimately play out, whether it will be to the advantage of the Democrats or the Republicans. So far, it's been to the advantage of the Democrats, but Democrats have a way of blowing things. So it could very well be that we won't do it right, and the consequence of that will be that we'll lose the golden opportunity to get political support. Immigration is also an extremely important foreign policy issue. I think one of the most important foreign policy issues for the future of the United States is our relationship with Mexico. And it is in our advantage for Mexico to be a prosperous democratic society, and it could be. There's no reason that Mexico could not be as prosperous as South Korea or Taiwan, and it has many more advantages than those countries, but it also has structural disadvantages: corruption, a dysfunctional political system, court system, great inequalities of wealth and income. The richest man in the world is a Mexican named Carlos Slim, who got it the good old-fashioned way. He monopolized, and who was able to become a very wealthy person and get into many other businesses. They only tax about 11% of GDP in Mexico. All those things have to be changed if Mexico is going to grow and prosper. The ultimate solution to the immigration question for the United States is what happens to Mexico. and whether they're able to develop or not. Some of that's taken care of itself. The Mexican birth rate is falling, and therefore the natural growth will slow down. The part that is difficult for us is whether or not they're able to get political and economic stability. And that's by no means assured. My view is what we should do in the United States is to use whatever leverage we have with Mexico and Canada. I would make it part of a multilateral foreign policy arrangement to get the kind of changes and development in Mexico that is in our interest and theirs. And I would pay a whole lot more attention to that than I do some other parts of the world that I think are less important for us. It also has important social stability implications, which I have also already mentioned. We also have, of course, a lot of problems in dealing with immigration in the country. Let me just tick them off and then go to my framework. One of the biggest problems that we have is that nobody's in charge of immigration. Just like I inherited it, there's no high-level cabinet officer in the United States, and that's different. Something as important as that should be, we should put somebody in charge of. There's no effective way in the United States to adjust the needs of the economy to immigration, the employment-based immigration. We do it by congressional act. The H-1B visa for college-educated immigrants, present level, was set in 1990. But there's been a lot of things happen since 1990. And the world's changed since 1990, and yet that still governs the importation of college-educated people. The consequence of that is it gets widely ignored. Is you encourage people, if you got something that won't work, then you encourage people to go around it and to find other ways to do it. And we got immigration lawyers in the country make a good living showing you how to game the system and therefore go around the system that ought to work a lot better. There's no great secret about what you need to do. It's harder to get it done. It's very well established in economics that if we bring in foreign workers to complement American workers, that will be good for everybody. Complement means you bring them in to do things that you're not doing. If you're a skilled worker, you bring in helpers, and that complements you. And therefore, you're both better off than you would have been before. However, if you bring in foreign workers to compete with and displace American workers, then people are worse off, and you build hostility. With our H-1B and L-1 programs, for example, we're currently building a lot of opposition from Americans to immigration. Why are we? Under those laws, the employer can displace an American under those provisions. An employer can displace American workers, reduce their wages, and it's perfectly legal to do that. It's also perfectly legal to say to an American worker under the L-1 program, if you want to get your severance pay, you've got to train the foreign worker who's taken your place. And that has been done by IBM. It's been done by many other companies. And the consequence of that, of course, is to build up hostility and to not be a plus-sum process. We have grossly inadequate protection for foreign workers. The euphemism that the Germans invented and that we use and I try to avoid is that they're guest workers. Well, if you saw how they treated the H-2B workers, and I commend to you a publication by the Southern Poverty Law Center called Almost Slavery, it tells the case about how people were abused. They would take away your travel documents, your passport. You were kept locked up practically, paid a lot less than you were promised. You were promised all kinds of things before they recruited you by recruiting agencies, which you never got. The conditions that you lived under were deplorable. And the consequence of that, of course, is that we create hostility between American workers who have to compete with those workers who are in almost slavery. So we need to do much more to protect the foreign and the domestic workers. My view is that once you bring in people to complement American workers, then we ought to go out of our way to see to it that we rigorously enforce our immigration and labor laws to protect them, and to see that they're not abused, and that people, you cannot seize their. Now, the H-1B program is very popular with employers, and they use it to justify and to argue that we've got a shortage of educated labor in the United States. You've seen the newspaper reports as they open up. The H-1B is limited to 85,000, ostensibly. Many more than 85,000 come in. Universities are not covered under that 85,000. Research organizations are not covered. Nonprofits are not covered. So you bring in a very large number of people. You are indentured to that employer for sometimes up to 10 years. And that employer decides whether you can become a legal permanent resident of the United States. So when you open that up every April, we're getting ready to do that, then the 85,000 tend to disappear in a relatively short time, and then the employers and editorial writers and others say, well, that shows you we got a serious shortage of college-educated workers in the United States. Doesn't show you anything of the kind. It shows you we've got a big demand for indentured labor, not that you've got a shortage of. You might have. The trouble is, we don't have a way to figure that out. You cannot allow employers with that kind of evidence to decide whether or not you have a shortage of labor. The other real problem, of course, is we've got the largest unauthorized immigrant population of any major industrialized country, and it's growing. And what's wrong with that? People say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. We need that labor. They only take jobs that American workers won't take. And therefore, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that those people go through very serious hazards to get here. And they're exploited at every step in the process. When they come here, they're usually exploited as well. They're easy prey to exploiters and predators among their own people, and therefore suffer greatly. And they live in the shadows of American society. It would be much better if we had people who came out of the shadows and were legal residents and could protect themselves. Our labor laws depend primarily on complaints by workers who are being exploited. If you are an indentured worker, or if you're an unauthorized worker, you're not likely to complain. And therefore, we're not likely to find out about the abuses that you have. And therefore, it's one of the reasons I quit relying on complaints. I had a program called the Employers of Undocumented Workers strategy. Nobody had to complain. We weren't enforcing immigration laws, but we were enforcing all the labor laws. And we found 100% violation. They never went into a place where they weren't violating massive non-compliance with our labor laws. Now, what should we do about all this? Well, the first thing I think we need to do is to put somebody in charge of it. Get a high-level federal official in charge employment-based immigration. My view would be we do it in the Labor Department. That's logical. Labor Department was created, only agency of government created to protect and promote the interests of American workers. And therefore, it's logical to have somebody at least the assistant secretary level to be primarily responsible for it. Right now, it's split all over the government, DHS, state, justice, labor, and nobody is really doing what needs to be done. Nobody even knows how many immigrants there are, how many legal immigrants there are. We know how many visas got issued through time, but you never know what happened to those people whether they took the visa and went to work or did anything else. We have no idea about how many H-1Bs there are. There are 85,000 a year. My estimate of H-1Bs and L-1s is at least 600,000. And that's not trivial. It's probably higher than that. But we don't know that. Now, you can't make policy with the kind of data we have in the United States about this very important issue. And even sometimes when they've got it and the Congress tries to jar it loose from the agencies, you can't get it. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense either. The second thing I would do would be to establish a clear objective for immigration policy. In my view, it should be shared prosperity. That ought to guide everything we do. The only other option is to say we're going to bring in people to compete by wages, by reducing wages. That's a loser, and you wouldn't want to win it. The United States is losing jobs to Mexico, where wages are about 20% of the United States wages, and they're losing jobs to China, which is with wages about 4% of U.S. wages. And that's a losing proposition. It implies lower and more unequal wages. The other option is what we had in this country from World War II up through the 1970s, shared prosperity. You know, that's what got a lot of us ahead. That it was a system where the government helped us. I went to school on the GI Bill, as millions of World War II veterans did. The return to the GI Bill for the federal government was between 500 and 1,000% after 10 years. It was very high return. And this budget hawks are trying to convince us that no government expenditures are investments. That's sheer nonsense. The GI Bill was a great investment. I had one of my Republican predecessors once say to me when we were launching a large jobs program, he says, "You wouldn't want another WPA, would you?" I said, "You should live so long and be so lucky as to have another WPA." I found my way around the Pacific Ocean with WPA charts. We had 2 aircraft carriers built by the WPA. And the Battle of Midway, we might well not have won if we'd had fewer aircraft carriers. You know the history of that. So the thing's still standing that we still have. I never went to a school that wasn't a WPA school until I got out of the Navy. So the idea that these are not public investments that are designed to create an opportunity structure to allow our people to move up, have high quality education for everybody. And then when you bring in immigrants, you put them on the same track. And that's the way you get the Canadian outcome and not the European outcome in terms of whether or not people get assimilated. Now, what's the framework for the first part of that framework is that we need to create a commission, I call it, a commission on foreign workers, to get the data and make the recommendations every year to Congress about how many foreign workers we bring in, and that should be based on the basis of shortages, which we identify and define objectively, not in terms of the way the employers would like to define it. Many employers will want to define it objectively because they understand that they need skilled workers, and they need to get people who are really in short supply. My rule would be you must always pay more. It must always cost you more to hire foreign workers, both in terms of what you pay the premiums and also because you don't depress wages. So that commission, which would be an independent, nonpartisan commission on foreign workers, my model for that is a British organization called the Migration Advisory Committee, which does that for the United Kingdom. The second thing that we need to do is to have a sensible and secure work authorization system. I tried to sell one to the OMB and the Congress and everybody that was very simple, and I thought very sensible. Instead of putting the employer in charge of it, let's have Federal Employment Agency in charge of it. Let them decide who's in the country legally. Have one identifying document that would be secure. The employer's only obligation would be to take that document when the worker showed up with work authorization, call an 800 number. Now you could use the internet. Write that number in the worker's file, and that's all you have to do. And that would mean, in order to have a rigorous employer penalty system, you need to make the obligation fairly sensible. The third thing I think we need to do, and in many ways the most difficult, is to have a path to earned legalization for unauthorized workers. Nothing else makes sense. Why should you do it? Well, you're not going to have a good legal system so long as you've got a large illegal system. One of the reasons that the farm employers don't use the H-2A program, which is no limit. You can bring in anybody, as many as you want, but you've got to pay the minimum wage and you've got to observe the law in order to bring them in. So we don't use that very much. Most of the farm workers they bring in are unauthorized because you don't have to provide housing. You don't have to observe any laws. As long as there's an illegal option, it's going to be hard to enforce the legal option. That's the reason you need to make it comprehensive. That, in many ways, is the trickiest part of the process, because what you have to do is to have a combination of carrots and sticks. The carrot is, if you come forth and register, you have a path to permanent residence in the United States. If you don't, there will be a high probability that you will be apprehended and deported. And you have to have that combination or it won't work. The danger, of course, is that you will drive people underground. And that makes it worse in terms of enforcing our laws. We also need to have a rational border and internal visa enforcement process, sensible. It's not sensible to believe that you can stop illegal immigration by building a wall. 40% or more of the unauthorized immigrants in the country came in with visas. And that you can be sure that if you built a wall, more would come in with visas. It's not sensible to believe that what you need to do with border protection is to apprehend everybody who's coming across. You need to establish some priorities. You need to apprehend as many as you can with a sensible system. But you need to focus on the people who are really going to cause you trouble. The criminals, the smugglers, the drug dealers. Now, you're not going to be able to do that unless you get the people to help you. The people along the border know about those things, suffer from it. And if you don't organize them against you, you might get them to help you. So I think that's great. The last one is to reform our temporary foreign worker programs and not create a new one. Many people say we need a large new guest worker program. We don't know that. There's no evidence for that. And they say, well, the obvious evidence is that we've got 8, 9 million unauthorized workers working. That shows they were short. Well, what would happen to those workers if we authorized their status is their wages would go up overnight. It always has, because they would be able now to change employers, to move, to go in other places. Now, what are the prospects to getting all that done? Not as great as it was when I went into it. You know, I have to say, and I'm kind of a pathological optimist. You know, I think that you can do things, and I think that it would be much more difficult now. Partly because President Obama, who was all for it during his first year, has limited his powers, not as great as it was when he first got started. Ted Kennedy died, and Chuck Schumer from New York took his place, and he's not Ted Kennedy. And that reduces your ability to get it passed, in my judgment. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the opponents of comprehensive immigration reform have solidified their position, are ready to filibuster, and therefore you've got to be able to break a filibuster to get it done. The fact that we're in a recession makes it harder. Many people will say, well, in the recession, people are going home, so you don't have to do anything now. Well, the trouble is that's always the case, but you will pick up and they hadn't all gone home, of course. And it's not the decline in unauthorized immigration is not mainly because of people going home. It's mainly because of more people not coming. And therefore, that is a very different dynamic. So, but my view is it's important enough that we need to keep trying to get it done. Well, thank you for your attention.
Dr. Marshall, thank you for being a pathologically sensible and a brilliant mentor to all of us. I'm very curious about the current economy. I wanted to ask you a question about that. We see teachers being laid off in hundreds and thousands and across the country, more than that. State workers, local workers about to be laid off in big numbers. What do you expect that will do to the economy that we're living in?
Well, it would do two things. One, it would make it harder for us to reduce unemployment. And secondly, it'd make it harder for us to compete with high value-added production in the future. Because as you know, if we don't have a world-class education system, one of the problems is that a lot of deficit hawks have convinced the public that we ought not to make this investment. The very best time to make the investment in your future, in your infrastructure, and in the human capital is now. It'd be a lot harder to do it later on, so it makes no sense to do what we're doing, I think.
So what will be the impact?
Well, I think it will be higher unemployment. Obviously, one of the things that's happened since the globalization of the labor market, which is not well understood, is that, from 1970s on to now, blue-collar workers with high school education or less have lower real wages than they did in 1970. Since 2000, college-educated workers have lower wages. The only people who have higher wages today, I don't know what the very latest number is, but the very latest evidence shows that people with postgraduate professional degrees are the only ones who have, and women are about as well off as they were in 2000. Not just because because you're increasing the wages of positions that women are in, but because women are getting into positions from which they were previously excluded. So they've been able to pretty much hold their own, college-educated women. But other men, especially, have much lower. Now, if we're going to add to the college-educated unemployed workforce, that's not a good thing.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My own view that the primary security threat to the U.S. is the destabilization of Mexico. And I believe the prime mover of the destabilization of Mexico is the drug policy of the U.S. Aren't you really going to have to tackle that as well to get a real comprehensive immigration policy?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. And I tried to do that when they passed the NAFTA. See, I opposed the NAFTA until we worked some things out. I was told by my economics colleagues that you didn't have to work anything out because what NAFTA was going to do is cause great growth in Mexico and increases in wages and cut down on the illegal immigration into the United States, all those things. And we were going to have a boom here. Well, you know, you don't get many good things in economics. I mean, many things that are so easily predictable is what was going to happen when you passed the NAFTA. And I rushed into print. You know, I said, you know, I've got so many losers, I've got to balance with the sure thing. And that was you're going to disrupt Mexico. You're going to have a lot of displacement in the ejidos. And you're going to, and in small, among small business, small farmers and others. And that's going to increase the flow. And, of course, it did. And I think that that's one of the reasons that if I were president, I would be giving heavy emphasis to trying to work out with Canada because Mexico is justifiably sensitive to bilateral relations with the United States. But multilateral, you could probably get it done. But there's some things Mexico would like to get, some things they wanted in the NAFTA. They wanted a development fund based on the European Maastricht Agreement, which I was for. Thought we ought to do that. It's in our interest for those places to develop, and therefore, but we didn't do it. And I think now we have to try to make up for that.
Thank you for an outstanding and thoughtful presentation.
Yeah,
this has left us with a lot to think about.